How's it going, everyone? Seems a long time since we've done this. We're going to jump into the Q&A, and a question came from Dawn. Her question is, I know I have moved onto supersets, but why is pairing two movements together in a superset better than doing the moves independently in two separate sets? I'm sure there must be some reasoning behind it, but I don't know what it actually is, so I am curious. So we are going to jump into the what, the why, the when, and hopefully have a take-home message. So we'll start with the what and explaining the method of supersets. So supersets are basically performing two exercises back to back with no rest in between. An example which we'll show on the next two, you could perform a squat followed by a bench press, and then you would take the prescribed rest. So the rest in between is basically the transition between exercises. You wouldn't take a set rest in between the exercise, but you would take a set rest between the sets. Now they can be categorized into two categories, basically. We've got a complementary example. So a back squat followed by a bench press. And this is simply states that separated supersets, which they are known as, is training different muscles with alternating exercises. So we know that when we train the back squat, we are training totally different muscles compared to when we train the bench press. The opposite of that, we have non-complementary examples. So these are known as grouped supersets. An example could be a front squat followed by a goblet squat, where these movements really replicate one another, training the same muscles with alternating exercises. So why do we actually perform supersets? It may seem a little bit out of the box thinking, but the biggest factor for actually performing a superset is time efficiency. An example here, if you are following a program or you have limited time available within the gym, then a superset can play a massive factor in you getting the most out of your training, because you are, say, pairing a squat movement pattern with a push movement pattern, and then you are pairing a hinge pattern with a pull pattern. Now, a lot of people tend to separate certain movements, so they may have more time to dedicate within that training week, whereas you might have a person who's really short on time, and superset could really be their calling for getting the most out of their training. As always, context is king, and then from the perspective that we are looking at with Dawn, we are actually looking to develop Dawn's work capacity. We'll explain why a little bit. So we are actually coming off the back of a strength block. So Dawn was fairly new to resistance training and hasn't really dabbled with it much. So we've done a program which is known as Dr. Yesse's 1x20 method, where basically you do one set of a load of movement patterns. It could be first day squat, hinge, vertical press, vertical pull, and then some accessories to follow with some core work. The reason behind this is just to introduce slowly and gradually resistance training and load to someone who hasn't dabbled with it before, without affecting or basically just sending them into a state of complete and utter soreness all of the time and struggle to recover from it. So we are coming off that block. So this seemed a good way of introducing some tolerance with supersets. We went 1x20, one by I think it's 14, and then 1x12 or 10, and then we actually went back up to 2x, I think it was 15, 2x around 10, I think again, and then 2x8. We kept going till we got to a point where around 3 sets, and now we've done that for the past couple of months. We've built a really solid base of strength tissues with the ligaments, tendons, muscle tissue, etc. Really good movement patterns. Now we're actually ready to go into this block of developing our work capacity with supersets. Now, if you look at it from work capacity standpoint, we're actually looking to create a little bit more, say, chaos or control chaos in a way, where we actually challenged Dawn in a different way. Now she's got two movements to perform back to back, whereas one she's had in isolation, so she could take her time, etc. But now we're looking at another form of intensity in a way of, okay, two movements back to back, getting the technique right, making sure we're lifting a decent load still, but also developing wear capacity in a case of performing one movement followed straight by another movement, and then we take the rest. Now, this table was taken from a research review looking at muscle damage in grouped supersets versus separated supersets, or muscle damage and muscle activation. And based on that review, they've come up with basically two categories: good supersets and bad supersets. So on the good side, we have two non-competing exercises. What we mentioned earlier, this could be a squat or training the legs followed by a bench or training the upper body. Adequate rest of 45 to 120 seconds between exercises, meaning 2 to 5 minutes of rest before repeating an exercise, just to make sure that fatigue isn't overly accumulated where we can't perform the next sort of set to the same quality. High quality training with the benefit of time saving, so time efficiency creeps up again, and useful for anyone who's time limited, which we have mentioned. On the right side, we've got bad supersets, so two exercises using the same muscle groups or movement patterns. One we mentioned earlier, which was a front squat followed by a goblet squat. Now, don't take that as a bad superset, but it's more a case of what's to follow. Insufficient rest, so 30 seconds or less between exercises, or 60 seconds or less before repeating an exercise, which basically states that you take really, really low rest in between two exercises that are training the same muscles with alternating movements, then you are pretty much setting yourself up for a recipe for disaster. Saves time, but training quality suffers, like we just mentioned. On the opposite side, this could potentially be useful in a shock training cycle or if training frequency is low. So what that means is in a shock training cycle, like we mentioned earlier, where you're looking to create a ton of stress from a physiological standpoint, if you're looking to maybe create hypertrophy adaptations, or from a frequency as low, if you've got a person who's training maybe on a Monday and they're not training again until the Friday or Saturday, then they've got enough time in between sessions to basically recover from the amount of muscle damage that is going to occur. You've already touched upon, but we now look at the when. As mentioned previously, people short on time may find this method useful. From our perspective with Dawn, people also looking to increase their tolerance to workload with resistance training. And finally, the take-home message. Supersets are a great training method to use when time is precious. It can be a tool to expose people to work capacity via more work done. Separated supersets seem the better choice when it comes to getting the most out of alternating exercise and body parts compared to grouped supersets, solely based on the ability to actually recover. And group supersets can cause greater muscle damage compared to separated supersets, which is one of the benefits. This may be beneficial during, as we mentioned earlier, a shock phase, a muscle building phase, or when training frequency is low. But biggest takeaway here, tread very, very carefully. One thing to mention, which we didn't really touch upon, is Dawn asked the question of, is training an exercise on its own not better than supersets? This should give you a little bit of an idea behind that, not necessarily, but based on some constraints looking at time efficiency, etc., it could be for that person. With Dawn, from that perspective, we're looking to build a little bit more wear capacity. But more often than not, if you can train exercises within isolation or on their own with greater amounts of rest, then this is going to create the likelihood of better recovery times, increased muscle and hypertrophy, increased strength, etc. So hopefully you took something from this presentation. If you got any further questions around this topic, don't hesitate to send them over, and we'll catch you in the next presentation.